Have you ever wondered, gazing at famous photographs of lighthouses amid a raging ocean, exactly what you're seeing? Don't rush to reply that it's a triumph of the human spirit or a monument to 19th century engineering ingenuity. You've been fooled. What we're served up as the heroic feat of Victorian-era builders turns out, upon closer examination, to be the most brazen falsification in the history of technical progress. Take a look at the La Jument lighthouse, or the famous Rocolle. Gaze at these lonely stone spires piercing the sky, where any modern platform, built using satellite calculations and titanium alloys, would be destroyed by the first serious storm. We're told these structures were erected in the mid-19th century, without helicopters, without floating cranes, without quick-setting concrete. Just ponder the official version. A group of workers in rowboats approaches a rock jutting a few feet out of the water and builds a tower 165 feet tall, withstanding wave strikes weighing hundreds of tons. Do you seriously believe this? Let's cast aside the school textbooks and engage critical thinking. We're at the point where official history collides with the laws of physics and logistics, and physics here is clearly not on the historian's side. Take, for example, the Armen Lighthouse in France, which the keepers themselves called Hell of Hells. Official sources claim construction began in 1867. We're told a touching tale of how brave Bretons landed on slippery rocks during low tide. Do you know how much time they had? According to official reports, in the first year of construction, workers managed to land on the rock just 7 times. 7 times in a year, and spent a total of 8 hours there. In 8 hours of work per year, they supposedly drilled holes for the foundation into granite harder than steel. Have you ever tried drilling wet granite with a hand auger, standing waist deep in icy water, when the ocean could sweep you away any second? It's not just difficult, it's physiologically impossible. But historians insist they did it. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you open the construction estimates and logs from that time, you'll find strange inconsistencies. The volumes of materials needed to erect such a tower number in the thousands of tons of granite and cement. Tell me, how on earth could you deliver thousands of tons of granite to a lonely rock in the middle of the Atlantic on wooden sailing ships? We're talking about the 19th century. No dynamic positioning systems for ships existed. Any attempt to approach the rocks close enough to unload heavy cargo, amid the constant swells typical of these latitudes, would end with the ship simply being smashed against the rocks. But the lighthouses stand. They stand where even today construction would require billion-dollar investments and unique technologies available to only a couple of corporations worldwide. And we're asked to believe that fishermen did this with pickaxes and shovels. There's another point that tour guides mysteriously remain silent about: the foundation. Any construction engineer will tell you that hydraulic concrete can't set if it's constantly swamped by waves. To build a lighthouse base at water level or below it, you need a caisson or a completely dry platform for an extended period. The official version states they used quick-setting cement. In the mid-19th century? Seriously? The technologies of that time barely allowed for quality port structures in calm harbors, and here we're talking about an aggressive, salty environment and constant vibration from wave impacts. Salt water erodes the binding mortars of that time in just a few seasons. But these lighthouses have stood for more than a century and a half, and their masonry looks monolithic, as if it were melted rather than laid from individual blocks. This suggests entirely different stone processing technologies we've lost or been forbidden to use. Gaze closely at photographs of the Bell Rock Lighthouse. It's the oldest surviving offshore lighthouse. Its construction dates to the early 19th century. Historians proudly declare it a wonder of the world. But if you analyze the blueprints, you'll see the use of dovetail joints in the stone blocks. Each block weighs more than a ton. Carving such a lock manually in granite with jewelry-like precision so that water doesn't penetrate the joints, this is a task for a CNC machine, not a chisel and hammer. And most importantly, why such complexities? Why such excessive strength if, according to the official version, the lighthouse is just a navigation marker? What if these aren't lighthouses at all? What if their true purpose was entirely different, and the lanterns on top were lit later, when the new masters of the world came to the ruins of a past civilization and repurposed the surviving giant structures for their own needs? The system lies to us not only about the construction methods, but also about the conditions in which it happened. We're approaching the most terrifying question. Why does no one consider sea level? All these impossible constructions become completely logical and straightforward if we allow for just one fact that official science furiously denies: the fact that the water level was entirely different. Imagine the ocean being lower by 165 feet, or perhaps even 330 feet. Then these rocks weren't deadly traps in the midst of the abyss, but hilltops or mountains on land. And building on them could be done calmly, transporting materials by roads that now lie on the seabed. But to admit this means admitting that quite recently, in the observable historical past, a planetary-scale catastrophe occurred that changed the world map beyond recognition. A catastrophe that's being carefully hidden from us, feeding us fairy tales about heroic stonemasons. Ponder why all these lighthouses have such strange architecture. Narrow towers widening at the base, resembling technical nodes of some gigantic energy grid more than living quarters for keepers. Inside these towers, it's cramped, uncomfortable, impossible to live there. The psyche of the people working at lighthouses often couldn't withstand it. Why? Perhaps because these structures were never intended for people? Their shape, their location, their incredible strength indicate that they were nodes of a single system, built by an advanced civilization in times when Earth's geography was different. And then the water came. The flood came, washing away cities, roads, and factories, leaving protruding above the surface only the tops of the tallest and strongest structures. And these tops we now call lighthouses. Official history is falling apart at the seams when we start cross-referencing dates and facts. We're told about a boom in lighthouse construction in the mid-19th century. Precisely at that time, thousands of the most complex structures were supposedly built worldwide. Where did the resources come from? Where did the qualified workforce come from after, as we're told, the devastating Napoleonic Wars and a series of revolutions? The population statistics of that time don't match the construction volumes. This is a demographic paradox. There were few people. They lived short lives. Technologies were primitive, but cities grew like mushrooms, sprouting granite embankments and cyclopean towers in the ocean. Here's the catch that anyone who has ever tried to build even a summer cottage with their own hands senses. We're dealing with appropriation. We are a scavenger civilization that occupied others' homes, unearthed others' factories, and called them our own. Watch the historians' hands. They show us paintings, engravings where sturdy workers lay stones. But why in photographs from the same period do we often see already completed structures surrounded by scaffolding, but without the workers themselves? Or with people who look like ragged tramps posing against the grandeur they clearly couldn't have created? This is the classic scheme of substitution. Create the illusion of a process to hide the result. Lighthouses are just the tip of the iceberg protruding from the water. What's hidden beneath the ocean's depths terrifies modern scientists to the bone. Because if you descend to the base of these rocks, you can find traces of stone processing extending deep into the abyss. Who processed the rocks at a depth of 165 feet? 19th century scuba divers? Or those who lived there when it was dry land? Let's move from general doubts to dry, merciless figures that demolish the official version faster than an ocean wave washes away a sand castle. We're talking about logistics. Logistics is what breaks any historian's fantasies. Take, for example, a standard sea lighthouse of that time, standing on a remote rock. The weight of such a structure ranges from 3,000 to 6,000 tons. That's only the above water part. Add the weight of the foundation, auxiliary equipment, and scaffolding. We get a colossal mass of cargo that needs not just to be transported from point A to point B, but delivered to conditions with no pier, no crane, and no level surface. Historians claim that transportation was carried out by small sailing barges or schooners. The cargo capacity of such a vessel in the mid-19th century, while maintaining maneuverability in dangerous waters, did not exceed 50 or 70 tons. Let's do some elementary math. To transport 4,000 tons of granite, it would require about 80 trips. And that's just the stone. Plus cement, tools, provisions, fresh water for workers, and for mixing mortar. That's hundreds of trips. In the conditions of the North Atlantic or Bay of Biscay, navigation is possible for at most 3 or 4 months a year, and even then with major interruptions for storms. Official reports state that some lighthouses were built in 3 or 4 years. If you divide the number of required trips by the number of working days, it turns out that a ship had to approach the rock every day, without weekends or holidays, unload and depart. Can you imagine unloading multi-ton granite blocks in a Force 3 swell? A sailing ship can't just stop and hit the handbrake. It needs to be held in place with a complex system of anchors and ropes. In the surf zone, where the water boils from strikes against the rocks, any helmsman's error means death. A wooden ship's hull would splinter against granite in seconds upon impact. But we're told that hundreds of trips passed successfully, without losses, without modern radio communication or weather forecasts. This is a statistical anomaly. This is impossible. Now look at the blocks themselves. These aren't just boulders piled in a heap. These are shaped elements carved with machine precision. Engineers call it stereotomy, the art of cutting stone into complex shapes. Lighthouse blocks often feature a tenon mortise system, not only in the horizontal plane, but also in the vertical. They interlock with each other like pieces of a gigantic three-dimensional puzzle. Achieving such precise fitting on the shore is difficult. Doing it in a quarry, then hoping that during assembly on a rocking rock under an icy shower everything aligns to the millimeter, this is madness. If even one block has a deviation of a couple of millimeters, the entire structure will twist. And filing granite with a rasp while dangling on a rope over the abyss is a hopeless endeavor. The conclusion follows. Either these blocks were cast right on site using geopolymer concrete technology, the secret of which is being hidden from us, or, more likely, no one built anything. These towers were already standing there, standing for thousands of years. And the builders of the 19th century were simply engaged in their repair, cleaning, and installation of their primitive oil lantern atop an ancient, high-tech device. Notice the absence of construction sites. Where did the workers live? On Rokal Rock, for example, there's simply no place to pitch a tent. There's no level ground. We're told tall tales that workers lived on ships anchored nearby. But any sailor will tell you that anchoring in the open ocean next to rocks is suicide. At night, the wind can shift, and the ship will be dashed against the rocks. So the ships had to return to port every evening? That's hours of travel there and back. When did they work? It turns out they had only a couple of hours a day. At such a schedule, construction of the Largement lighthouse would have taken not 5 years, but but 50. There's one more detail that gives away the falsification completely. It's the cranes. On old engravings, they're depicted as wooden cranes, anchored directly to the rock. But to anchor a crane that lifts a 2-ton block, you first need to build a foundation for that crane. And to build the foundation, you need to deliver materials. It's a vicious circle. Without a crane, you can't build a crane. Modern helicopters solve this problem in an hour, but there were no helicopters then. How did they lift the first beam? How did they secure the winch on smooth, wave-washed stone? The physics of the lever is inexorable. To lift a load at the end of the boom, you need a counterweight or a powerful anchor fastening. In granite, without drills and chemical anchors, creating a reliable anchor point for a heavy crane is practically impossible within the time allotted by the official version. And let's not forget the human factor. Who were these people? We're told they were simple stonemasons, but working at such heights, under constant stress and isolation, requires training on the level of special forces or astronauts. Mortality should have been colossal. People should have been swept away by waves, dying from hypothermia and injuries. But in official documents, silence. Only a few died. It looks like a picnic report, not the construction of the century in hell. Either the documents are forged to hide the mass death of slaves, or there was no construction at all. We're confronted with the fact that the technology level of the 19th century absolutely doesn't match the complexity of the objects attributed to it. It's like being told that Egyptian pyramids were built by peasants with copper saws. Only with lighthouses, the situation is even more absurd, because pyramids stand on solid ground, while lighthouses are in an aggressive, deadly environment. We see the result of a civilization that surpassed us in understanding materials and strength of materials. A civilization that could afford to build monumental structures, where today we fear even to sail. But why? Why would someone in deep antiquity need to place these spires around the entire perimeter of continents? If we accept the theory of low water levels, the picture starts to clarify. These aren't navigation markers for ships. These are geodetic benchmarks, or perhaps nodes of atmospheric electricity. Look at the shape of the Fresnel lens. This is the most complex optical device that appeared suddenly, out of nowhere, immediately in a ready, perfect form. The technology for processing glass of such purity and such complex curvature on an industrial scale at the beginning of the 19th century raises no fewer questions than the granite blocks. Open old maps. No, not the ones hanging in the geography classroom, but genuine 16th and 17th century navigation portolans that miraculously survived in private collections and closed archives. If you overlay them on modern satellite images, a cold sweat will break out. The coastline on them looks entirely different. Where today the Atlantic waves rage, old maps mark cities, roads, and star-shaped fortresses. Those very rocks where lonely lighthouses now huddle are marked as hilltops or watchtowers on the outskirts of large land settlements. This changes everything. Absolutely everything. We're approaching the key moment of our investigation, which official science tries to talk away with terms about the inaccuracy of ancient cartography. We're told that medieval sailors couldn't draw maps, that they erred by hundreds of miles. Do you believe that people capable of crossing oceans under sail couldn't distinguish an island from a shoal or land from sea? This is a lie designed to hide the catastrophe. The truth is that the world ocean level rose, and this happened not millions of years ago, but quite recently by historical standards. Literally yesterday. Look at lighthouse foundations from a hydrological perspective. Modern studies of the seabed around such objects as the Eddystone or Bishop Rock lighthouses reveal strange anomalies. Echo sounders draw pictures that geologists call natural formations, but any architect will see ruins in them. From the base of the rocks on which the lighthouses stand, long, straight ridges often extend, remarkably resembling submerged roads or remnants of fortress walls. Officially, this is explained by geological faults, but nature doesn't build straight lines and right angles. We see remnants of infrastructure that went underwater. Now imagine the situation in the 19th century. The world has just experienced something horrific. A global cataclysm, a flood, clay rain, call it what you will. The water rose, swallowing coastal plains. Surviving people, our civilization, are redeveloping this changed world. They venture out to sea and see the tops of giant, ancient structures protruding from the water. Towers that were once part of city fortifications or an energy grid from a past era have now turned into islands. What do the new masters of life do? They don't build them from scratch. They lack the strength, technology, or resources for that. They simply approach the surviving towers, perform cosmetic repairs, hang a plaque reading "Built in 18XX", and claim the merits of ancient architects for themselves. This explains the absence of normal construction documentation and oddities in the datings. Often, construction start dates differ by decades across sources. Why? Because these weren't construction start dates, but dates of discovery and deconservation of the object. Photographs passed off as the construction process most often show the already completed tower in scaffolding. Where's the foundation pit? Where's the foundation laying process? They're absent because the foundation extends hundreds of feet underwater to where there was once solid ground. Workers in the photos are simply cleaning the facade and mounting stairs. They look like ants crawling over a dinosaur skeleton. Let's talk about materials. The granite from which the lighthouses are made often differs in composition from the rock of the cliff it's standing on. Geologists shyly avert their eyes when asked how that's possible. If the lighthouse was built from local stone, why is it different? And if the stone was hauled hundreds of miles, why when there's a whole rock right underfoot? The answer is simple. It's artificial stone. Geopolymer concrete of the highest quality, which an ancient civilization produced on an industrial scale. They could cast these towers monolithically, layer by layer, right on site. This explains the absence of seams, the incredible strength, and the complex geometry of the blocks. We, having stumbled upon these technologies, still can't replicate their recipe, calling it simply granite. There's another aspect about which it's customary to remain silent: bathymetry, depth charts. If you carefully study the nautical charts around famous lighthouses, you'll discover that many of them stand on the edges of vast underwater plateaus. These were former continental shelves that were land before the flood. The lighthouses marked the boundaries of these lands. They weren't navigation markers for ships, but geodetic markers, border posts, or repeaters standing on elevations. When the water came, it concealed the plains, but couldn't conceal these colossal spires. Historians try to convince us that in an era when in London people died of cholera due to the lack of sewerage, and the main transport was the horse, the government spent colossal budgets on building palaces for lanterns in the middle of the ocean. Why such luxury? Why make lighthouse entrance portals in the form of antique arches with columns? Who would appreciate this architecture amid a storm? Fish? This architectural extravagance reveals the true origin of the objects. They were built as part of grand ensembles, intended for the eyes of people living in cities around these towers. Cities that now sleep under layers of silt and sand. Recall the legends of sunken lands: Atlantis, Lemuria, Kitezhgrad, Lyonesse. The folklore of all the world's peoples preserves the memory of how the sea swallowed land. Lighthouses are the only material evidence we have left on the surface. They stand like gravestones for a perished civilization. And when a 19th century lighthouse keeper lit the lamp, he unwittingly activated a surviving node of an alien system. We also need to ask what's beneath the lighthouses. Some old reports mention cellars and tunnels extending deep into the rock. Why does a lighthouse need a deep cellar? To store kerosene? But the dampness there is such that any metal would rust away. What if these shafts lead to underground communications that connected these objects into a single network even before they became islands? Modern enthusiast researchers trying to scan lighthouse bases with ground-penetrating radars encounter their equipment going haywire or showing voids of precise geometric shapes deep within the rock mass. Now that we've understood that the lighthouse buildings themselves are ancient, pre-flood structures, it's time to look inside. And what we'll find there will finally demolish the myth of 19th century primitiveness. We're talking about technologies that official science calls simply ingenious engineering solutions. But any physicist, if honest, would call them impossible anachronisms. The main secret is hidden in the very heart of the lighthouse, in its rotating mechanism and optical system. Have you ever heard of mercury baths? Official history states that to smoothly rotate the giant lens, whose weight could reach several tons, 19th century engineers devised placing it in a bowl filled with liquid mercury. Supposedly, this reduced friction almost to zero. Sounds logical? Only to those who've never worked with hazardous metals. We're talking about tons of mercury. At the Cape Lighthouse, for example, hundreds of gallons of this toxic liquid metal were used. Imagine the scene: a wooden ship, a storm, and stevedores hauling barrels of mercury onto the rock. One clumsy move, and the spilled metal would poison all life around for decades. But we're told this was standard practice. However, why such complexities? Ordinary bearings, even primitive ones, could handle the rotation task. Why use a rare, insanely expensive, and deadly dangerous material? The answer lies in the physical properties of mercury, about which museums remain silent. Mercury is not just a lubricant. In ancient texts, in Indian Vimanas, mercury is described as a key element of engines and energy generators. It's an ideal conductor, capable of interacting with electromagnetic fields. If you spin mercury in a closed loop, you'll get a powerful vortex effect capable of generating energy or creating anti-gravity fields. Lighthouses are not lanterns, they are generators. The mercury baths under the lenses were needed not to reduce friction, but to create a rotating plasma field. The lighthouse structure itself is a giant inductance coil. The stone tower, often reinforced with metal, stands in salt water, which is an excellent electrolyte. This is a ready scheme for harvesting atmospheric electricity, that very ether energy that Nikola Tesla later tried to rediscover and for which he was erased from history. Lighthouses were nodes of wireless energy transmission. They didn't emit light, they radiated energy, powering those very star-shaped fortresses and cities whose ruins we find worldwide. Recall the stories of lighthouse keepers going mad. Literature and cinema romanticize this, blaming it all on loneliness and the roar of waves. But the symptoms described by doctors of that time, hair loss, hallucinations, tremors, personality disintegration, are the classic picture of severe mercury vapor poisoning and exposure to powerful electromagnetic fields. Keepers didn't go mad from longing. They died from radiation and toxins emitted by damaged but still active systems of ancient machines. They lived inside an operating reactor, trying to fuel it with firewood and coal. Official science carefully ignores the fact that many lighthouses were equipped with the most complex ventilation systems, which are utterly unnecessary for venting smoke from a single lamp. These systems were intended for cooling power plants. Shafts running through the entire lighthouse shaft functioned as waveguides. If you enter an old lighthouse and look up, you'll feel like you're inside an organ pipe. It's an acoustic and vibrational resonator. Sound and vibration played a key role in the operation of these stations.
Perhaps they were used for harmonizing space, weather control, or even long-distance communication based not on radio waves, but on the resonance of the planet itself. We live amid the ruins of a world that was an order of magnitude more complex than ours. We walk their roads, live in their rebuilt houses, and gaze at their towers, calling them lighthouses. But the truth is breaking through. Mercury in the basements, impossible optics, granite blocks interlocked like a lock. These are clues that can't be hidden. The 19th century, which they paint for us as an era of steam and progress, was actually an era of scavenging and inventorying. Those who seized power after the catastrophe, let's call them the new managers, were busy unearthing surviving cities. We know this as buried ground floors, restoring railroads, and adapting mechanisms they didn't understand to their primitive needs. Lighthouses are the most visible, most obvious evidence of this process. They couldn't be hidden or demolished. They were too monumental. So they were simply renamed. The Mandela Effect in action. They altered our past to control the future. We live in a reality of total cargo cult. We look at ancient architecture, cathedrals that function as resonators, star-shaped fortresses, and think it's just beautiful. We are children who found a smartphone and use it to crack nuts. Official history turns us into idiots who believe that the planet's greatest structures were built for religious ecstasy, or, as with lighthouses, to save a couple of fishing boats. They've instilled in us an inferiority complex toward our ancestors while hiding their true greatness, reducing everything to chisel and hammer. Think about what's still hidden underwater. If lighthouses stand on the peaks of submerged mountains, then below, on the shelf, entire megacities lie. Oceanography is one of the most classified sciences for a reason. We're not allowed to know that the ocean floor is littered with ruins, roads, and pyramids. Lighthouses are merely periscopes of that gigantic hidden world. They continue to stand like sentinels, awaiting the moment when the water recedes again, or when people finally wake up and figure out how to flip the switch.